Hello everyone, thank you for joining us tonight and welcome to this NorthBound Book Award panel. I'm Rosie, I'm from the publisher Saraband, who offers the award in partnership with New Writing North and the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. I'm really thrilled to be joined by the three brilliant winners of the award from when it started in 2019 up to our most recent winner in 2021. And I'll be asking questions tonight about their books and their experiences so far with the award at all the various stages that they are at in the process at the moment. So we have J.A. Mensah, who won the inaugural award with her novel Castles from Cobwebs, followed by John D. Rutter in 2020 with his novel Approval, and then Adam Farrar, who won this year with his memoir Cold Fish Soup. And while we'll be discussing, sorry about that. While we'll be discussing all the books, this event is also to particularly celebrate today because it's the publication date of the fantastic Approval by John D. Rutter, which I have here. So before I pass over to our authors, I'll just let you know how the structure of tonight is going to go. I'm going to start by asking our authors to introduce themselves and their books, and then I'll go straight into some questions about Northern writing generally, followed by specific questions for each author. We'll also be getting some readings throughout, which is really exciting. I'll then explain a little bit more about the logistics of the award, who's eligible, and then we'll go into some audience questions for the last half an hour. So if you do have any questions, please just pop those into the YouTube chat and we'll try and answer as many as possible. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to our authors to introduce themselves. I'll go in chronological order of who won the award first. So Juliana, if you'd like to go first and introduce yourself and your book.
Thank you, Rosie. My name is Juliana. I publish as J.A. Mensah. My novel is called Castles from Cobwebs, and it won the inaugural award in 2019. It's the story of a young woman who is left as a child on a Northumbrian island, and she's found by a nun and raised by her. And at the age of 19, she receives a phone call from her maternal aunt in Ghana, who tells her that her biological mother has died. And the book tracks her journey to Ghana to attend this funeral, but also her journey to answer lots of questions about who she is and the histories of how she came to be in Northumberland.
Wonderful, that's great. John, if you'd like to go next, and introduce Approval, which is out today.
Thanks, Rosie. So I'm John. I write as John D. Rutter. This is today, Approval. It's the story of a man called David and his wife Cece, who embark on the process of trying to adopt a child, and they have to go through a process which effectively becomes an examination of David's life. It mainly focuses on his point of view. So it's really an examination of the process itself and of the history of a person's entire life. And I guess it's asking the reader a number of questions about the process and about, well, how would you feel if somebody was to go through every part of your history and leave no stone unturned? And at the end, well, you have to make a judgment whether to approve or not, I guess.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And Adam, if you'd like to say a bit about yourself and your book too.
Yeah, my name's Adam Farrar, and my book is called Cold Fish Soup, and it's a memoir written in essays about life and death and family and unusual behaviour on the crumbling Yorkshire coast. And there are 10 essays in the book. It's got like a kind of a chapter structure to it. So there's a theme that runs through all of the essays. But you've got coastal erosion and burlesque dancing pensioners and werewolves and all kinds, just a kind of strange phenomena and people that exist on the largely forgotten Yorkshire coast.
Great, and your brilliant mum, who's my favourite character. So I thought I'd start with some questions for you all and just kind of set the scene about Northern writing, really, and as this is the NorthBound Book Award, and ask a kind of very open-ended question, which you can take as you wish. But what does Northern writing mean to you, or what does it mean for for a piece of work to be kind of northern in essence. Up to you, who wants to go first?
He's feeling confident.
Yeah.
Well, I think Juliana and I have both had pieces included in an anthology called Test Signal that came out last month, and it's 22 pieces of new northern writing. And I think the main thing they have in common is that they're all incredibly different. You know, there's no one style that anyone adheres to. So it's a nice banner to be under, because I wouldn't be in that book if there wasn't a northern writing label. But I know if I consider what northern writing is, I think of the live literature scene in the Northwest, and in particularly in Manchester. You know, before the pandemic, there were spoken word nights of every kind of poetry and non-fiction and fiction all over the city, and you could, any night of the week, you could go and see spoken word nights, several people getting up and trying out material. It was a real testing ground for writers producing new material, and it's where I got my grounding. So when I think of northern writers, it's those back rooms in pubs all across the city. You know, with then those rooms are just full of stories, really.
I just echo exactly what Adam said, really, that there's something about, and I've spent most of my life in the Northwest, and there's something about both the live events and the publishing industry that goes with it, that I've been to lots and lots of events and made attempts to read at a few and listen to lots, but also there are so many independent publishers that you think, where will I get a career start? And of course, the three of us have had this opportunity through New Writing North. And you think about the independent publishers, and perhaps you'll join in either Saraband, Comma, Blue Moose, Dead Ink, who are publishing Test Signal, Fly on the Wall in Manchester. Sorry, Rosie, I'm listing all your competitors, but there is the Northern Fiction Alliance as well. It is a kind of collaborative and an inclusive industry, and you just feel that if you were reliant on, big agent or big publisher in London, none of us would be here tonight. None of us would actually get a book published. So that's something that I think is very important about this event and about writing in the North. That yes, you can go to events. We even manage them sometimes up here in Preston and Chorley, but Manchester, there's always something on, as you say. Well, there always used to be, and it's coming back again now. But for listening, for writing, for reading, it's the place to be.
Yeah, you're making me miss those back rooms of pubs and spoken word nights and things. Juliana, do you have anything to add on that one?
I completely agree with what's been said. I also feel like I need to wave the banner for the Northeast, because that's where I spent most or all of my adult life. And kind of similar to what's been said, there is this real strong sense of a community of writers on a very local level, and there's a lot happening. And as well as spoken word events, I've done some writing for theatre, and the theatre scene is where I've tried things out a lot, and you can kind of show work in progress and get feedback on it, and it helps you hone what you're doing. So Northern writing feels like this kind of huge broad banner, and when I think of my North, it's quite local, and it has been the Northeast. Before this event started, we were mentioning that I've just recently moved to Yorkshire, and I had a slight identity crisis. Could I still say I was from the Northeast? Could I still say I was from Newcastle when I now live in York? But one of the things that I think has drawn me to the North, as well as physically being here, is that it's marginalized a lot in kind of national narratives of the country. And as a Black woman who has an identity that's marginalized in similar ways, it's been very easy to find a home. It feels as though there's an understanding of what it is to not see yourself in the mainstream narratives. And it's been very nice to find a home in a place that understands that. And as John was saying, and as Adam has said, nurtures the talent that's there and creates a community for people.
Yeah, that's such a lovely insight and answer. I think what all of you have said has just spoken, and all your books actually speak to the huge diversity of writing in the North, and it's often so overdetermined sort of what Northern writing is. So it's really nice to hear all those different perspectives on it. So kind of leading on from that question, but more specifically about your own books, I wondered how the North really serves as a backdrop to your work, either sort of physically in the physical surroundings or in a kind of less tangible way. Juliana, if you would like to jump in on that. I know there's some beautiful kind of Northern scenes in your book.
Yeah, I think so. In my book and in I think everything that I've written in adult life, the North is always the physical backdrop, not always, and different parts of the North. So Northumberland, Newcastle, Durham, various parts of the Northeast. And it's precisely for the thing that I was saying around it being a landscape that feels as though it has been marginalized in stories of this country. And I'm usually exploring characters who are dealing with something, whether it's identity or a particular change in their life, but something about the landscape connects with what they're going through. And that has always kind of interested me.
Yeah, and I think that's so apparent in Castles, the like drama of Holy Island. It just captures you from the beginning.
Could I say, just you mentioning Castles, I realized I hadn't mentioned it, but really specifically with that book, the way that the landscape kind of mirrors or is in conversation with what she's going through is the Castles is set on Lindisfarne or Holy Island, a fictionalized version of it. And it's a tidal island. So there are certain times when the island is accessible from the mainland and you can walk across, and other times when the sea completely covers it and it's completely isolated. And there was something about that rhythm of connection and isolation that the land goes through that mirrored and was in conversation with what the character was experiencing. So yeah, I feel like the North has lots of really rich and interesting places that I can play with those ideas and have it as the backdrop.
Yeah, wonderful. That's a great answer. Adam, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, I recognised reading Juliana's book. I recognised we had similar themes. We've got completely different books, but there's that idea of the environment reflecting the experiences that people were going through. Like my stories are all set on an area of coast that's just tumbling into the sea, and it's like a deprived area that no one really cares about, and it's affected the way that people behave in that environment. So yes, we've got these sort of similar themes of connection between people and the space. But I know really the North is, like Juliana, it's the only place I've ever written about. You know, Northern writing is just writing because that's all I've ever known. But I know, although I've written stories about my family and, you know, idiosyncratic people, they also feel like they couldn't have been set anywhere else. There's something peculiar about some regions of the North, and the particular region that I'm writing about, which is largely forgotten. You know, no one cares that it's falling in the sea. And because of that, I think it's evolved in an unusual way. And it's affected the stories I'm able to tell and the kind of writer I am. I don't know what kind of writer I would be if I wasn't in the North. So it's almost as if the environment is as much of a character as the people that I'm talking about.
Yeah, that definitely rings true. Having read the book, I definitely know what you mean. You really, Within Sea feels very, very real. John, what about you?
Yeah, so mine, I certainly have less of the physical landscape that really seems to be an essential part of both of your books. But something that particularly touched me, Adam, when you started, there's mentions of Morecambe, and as soon as you start to tap into that declining seaside thing, that links back to my childhood and the very first things that I wrote, not in childhood, quite recently, about Blackpool and Morecambe and Llandudno going down to the North Wales coast, there is something about in both of your books about the seaside and the relationship between the characters and the landscape that's really effective and does, I think, have a special characteristic about northernness. In mine, I suppose the only two thoughts really is that the fictions are all set in the Northwest, and I've had to sort of fabricate one or two names of authorities and that kind of thing because the real processes involved are confidential. But I do name a couple of real pubs, and I think there's something quite specific. The nearest I get to description is when I'm describing what it's like in the old John o'Gaunt in Lancaster. And when you spoke earlier, Rosie, about, there's all of us about those rooms, the back room in the pub with the upstairs of the pub in Salford, where someone's launching a book with 11 people. It's going to hold out for the duration of the event. There is something special about the internal landscape where the people and place are connected as well for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating, that the sort of blurring boundary between people and place and how they connect and overlap. So we've already mentioned how sort of different your books are, even though there's overlapping themes. And I think where they really differ is in terms of their genre and their form. And I would say that all of them kind of challenge the traditional forms and sort of structures that you'd expect in their genre. And I just wondered for each of you what kind of drew you to the form and structure that you did choose, if it was just the natural way you felt to write the stories that you were writing, or if it was a deliberate choice to complement the also different, but as Adam mentioned, kind of overlapping in some ways, themes. I'll go to John first, just to keep mixing
well, mine definitely began as short stories, and for a number of years I'd only ever written short stories, and it's been a really interesting process as it's evolved from short story to novel. And do you want me to go into the specifics of how that happened? Would that be useful?
Yeah,
so,
of course.
So I've written, I think at the time I'd written 79 short stories. I think 79 was the first that was published in a book. And my two tutors at Edge Hill, Roger Glass was looking at individual stories and patiently looking at them two at a time. It'll come. The thing that binds them together, the unifying, the connecting, don't work on that. Don't worry about that. It'll happen. And second supervisor, Kim Wiltshire, who's to blame for this book, really, she was on sabbatical for that period and came in with she's known for sort of big picture view. And she said, you've written lots of different types of stories, but these personal ones about home, family, parents, relationships, those seem to be more the thing. But why don't you go and sit and write down, do that morning pages thing and blurt out what's going on in your mind. And simultaneously, several things happened at once. The first was the realization that in real life, the adoption process and childlessness has become a really dominant emotional thing for me. The second was the realization that if that is drawn in, and I had a couple of stories already on that theme, then the book is about something. And at the same time, this sort of magical device that if I preface each story with an imagined questionnaire page from that process, now I've got a structure and a shape. What was perhaps the most interesting part is that what was presented then as a collection of short stories has morphed naturally, and I think between Saraband and Craig Hillsley editing, and obviously I've had a little input as well, we've sort of knocked a few corners off so that it's got more of a kind of novel shape, like a dinosaur, very thin at one end and goes up and then comes down at the other end. Took Attenborough about 2 hours to describe that. Dinosaur shaped, beginning, middle, and end with a rising plot arc, and it just sort of has that shape to it. So with some chopping and changing, it's become a novel because in the end it is a quest. So it's been really interesting to learn things about form and structure. But actually, I've only ever intended to write short stories, and before and since only ever written short stories. I have to say that, so they'll let me back into short story club.
Yeah. Wow. So that the form kind of chose you in a way.
Yeah, it just kind of appeared. And I think writers hate it when you say this, but I'd been writing for 5 years, and what I had was a series of folders of short stories, and probably more than 100 individual pieces. And then in a moment, it just sort of appeared, and 2 days later, I had the first substantial draft of approval.
Yeah.
When people say, "Oh yes, I wrote the entire thing in a week," I hate it.
Yeah, of course. Juliana, what about you? Was your form a kind of deliberate choice, or was it it was the natural way that
it wasn't deliberate at all. And I tried lots of different things and they weren't quite working. And I think every time I came to the book and tried to do a new draft, I ended up tearing the whole thing apart, or tearing bits apart and trying to put it back together in different ways. And I've only recently realized this, actually, but I think it was around 2018, towards the end of 2018, I went to a workshop up in Scotland in a place called Hospital Fields. And the facilitator there asked each of us, we were all writers or artists, creative practice researchers in some way, asked each of us to try and find a guiding metaphor for what we were trying to do, and use that when we were thinking about the next stage of what we were doing. And kind of cobwebs, spiderwebs, and Nancy tales was something that was always in the book. And suddenly I decided that, well, I think it had been with me unconsciously, but I consciously realized that the spider in its web was the thing that was my guiding metaphor. And one of the things I really liked about it was that a spider's web is not a self-portrait. It's this thing that it creates. But if you analyze it, the spider's web has its DNA in it. So how could I create this thing that wasn't a portrait of myself, was this thing that I wanted to tell and explore and had lots of different threads, but that was still completely a part of me and part of the questions that I wanted to ask. And once I kind of hit on that, or brought that to consciousness, I suppose, it became easier, because I realized that all of this stuff and all of these different characters and storylines that at some points felt tangential, perhaps they had a place, and there were some that perhaps I needed to get rid of, some that I needed to add depth to, but it just gave me a way to think about it that was related to kind of traditional structures of storytelling, but also different, and freed me up from having to try to force it into a shape that it really wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't listening to all of the ways I was trying to bend it, but thinking about it like a spider web, and like the thing that the spider tries to do, it suddenly things made sense.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a wonderful way of describing that. And I couldn't imagine the book in any other form really than the form it is in. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Adam, what about you? Because your book is kind of very interesting in terms of where to place it as genre. It's a memoir, but it's also essays, and I think the form is really interesting there.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to John's really. I envisioned it as something else, like it was a series of standalone essays about life on the Yorkshire coast, and I'd define them all with a different theme. And then it was working with my mentor, Jen Ashworth. She helped me sort of guide it into the shape that it's in now, because every month I would send her a piece of writing and she'd critique it, and then we'd have a Skype session and we'd discuss what was going on. And she was able to hone in on these reoccurring themes that were running through all of the essays. So she suggested at some point, maybe you need to write an essay that will act as chapter one in a novel. So one that would set the scene and drop the reader in the environment, lay out the characters and some plot points. And if someone like Jen suggests things to you, you just listen. So I wasn't going to not follow that advice. So I wrote this essay, and it's like it really worked. It all seemed to sort of pull everything together, and I had like this very defined start. So that meant that I had to have a very defined end. So I had had this idea that I could work towards, and then I just had to tie all these threads together between these start and end points. So it really evolved through the writing, and through not being stubborn and sticking to my idea. I think it would have been easier in some ways to just stick to my 10 individual stories, but working it as a cohesive, connected body of work, I think it's become a much more interesting story. So really, yeah, it's a lesson in listening that's got me to where I am.
Yeah, and those two, start and end, really do act as kind of perfect bookends for the book itself. Which is that the Tony Harrison poem, Bookends?
Yeah, that's included in there as well, because it sort of very directly relates to my relationship with my dad as well. There's and that was another bit of advice. I'd written about all of my family in this book, and my dad was a character that was just there in the background. And Jen, another bit of advice from her was to just bring your dad into the foreground, and he's one of my favorite characters in the book now. So yeah, I'll always listen to people.
Yeah,
because they tend to know better than me.
A good lesson to take away. So I'll move on now to asking questions. We'll start with, for everyone specifically, I'll start with John, as it is Approval's publication day, and congratulations. And I'll just start by asking how it's feeling to be published and for Approval to be.
Yeah, it's fantastic, because it's taken sort of 10 years to get there. And it's a very strange thing to have a relationship with the physical thing. And funnily enough, Jen taught me at Lancaster, and so you remember lots of things and they immediately sort of come back. And I remember she made a comment at the launch of one of her books, that as soon as she saw it on the shelf in the book shop, she wanted to take the scissors to it. There's a point, I think, where it's finished once it's left you, and it had gone through so many changes. I'll take that story out, put this one in, edit this piece, change that piece. At the point where you can just sit back, and we were speaking earlier about the design, Dan Gray's brilliant art on the front cover, that I literally had nothing at all to do with that, and somebody else is doing things, and that's been a joy to see it just sort of take shape as a real 3D object. Because almost everything, quite a few of my stories have been published, but mostly online. There's maybe half a dozen in anthologies, but to actually have the physical thing, that's a whole new, different experience. So the main thing now is I'm kind of reverting back to my business self and becoming a salesman, and sort of carrying it around and costing people on trains and thinking about the business side of it, because I've had no further input for some months. It's quite strange that I'm distant from it, and for the first time I can pick it up and think, oh, this is quite good. When there's been a couple of times, I don't know if you two felt the same, where you're just sick of the damn thing and you just try and put that in a folder, and I'm not looking at that for a while. That's something that you both experienced as well.
Yeah, I can strongly relate to that. I remember when I won the award, I was elated. I was so happy. But then there was this part of me that was like, oh God, I need to edit it. I'll need to have to work with an editor. And yeah. So.
Yeah, I feel that same kind of, there's that shock, that pleasant shock. Oh my God, I've won a thing. And then, oh God, I've got to work on the thing, and I've got to change it, and I've got to look at it again. When I guess we were both at the same point where when we submitted it, we were done broadly. So
I was sick of it.
Yeah.
But then you get very beautiful, tangible.
Yeah. Also, books are great.
Yeah, you've got that to look forward to, and when you first see the cover, and Juliana, when you saw yours, it's a wonderful cover. You just think, oh wow, that's a real thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the main things at the sort of publishing stage. It's completely different to the solitary experience of writing, and of course it leads to these sorts of things where you meet people, and then of course you've got to write the next book, and we'll speak.
Yeah, but kind of going back to the start almost, I wanted to ask, so the book is it's told from a male perspective of the adoption process, born from a kind of experience of involuntary childness and infertility, and that is an issue which obviously affects many and affects lots of men, but I think we rarely see the male experience of that, and especially in fiction. I know there's a slight kind of uptick in a bit more non-fiction kind of documentaries about it, but I wondered what drew you to exploring the topic through fiction specifically rather than any other way.
Well, it's quite interesting having Adam here tonight, because we are, I think, at a time where, well, we can start to say, actually, this was a difficult experience, so this is real things that happened to me. And in my case, writing about real things, well, there is something semi-autobiographical about everything that we write, but in particular, some of the stories in Approval relate to the real life experience of going through that process for real. So the experiences of losing babies, of fertility treatments, of IVF, of then going through this process to, please can I have permission to have a child. There was a very, very personal thing, and by being able to imagine a character a bit like me, called David, and have him experience those things. And whilst it's a character study and he's got a life of his own in the novel, it really, for me, being able to write in fiction about things I don't think I've been able to properly talk about, well, childlessness, for example, because blokes don't really do that, and we don't talk about mental health. You know, these are new things that, you know, the agenda would still quite often be, you know, football, cars, maybe work, relationships, maybe, but it's nice to have a route into being able to talk about things that I'm now, in only the period since Approval won the award, I've had conversations with friends and said, oh yeah, we went through that. And I'm like, but we've been to the pub together 37 times. You didn't tell me either. And so I'm pleased that it now starts to open up that, yeah, it's a not spoken about subject, and it affects lots and lots of people. There are thousands of people going through the application process. Where at the time we went through the process in real life, 70,000 children in care. Now it's 80,000 children in care. So there is an important social issue. So it's nice that it's about something, but it comes from, you know, my own experiences that I haven't talked about. You don't go to the pub with the guys you've known for 10 years, 20 years and start saying, you know, we finished discussing this summer's transfer window and say, oh, by the way, I was in the IVF clinic the other day. And if you do, as I have in the fiction, even then, in a laddish kind of jokey way, it's very difficult to say that it's a book about a man trying to be a parent. And I found it quite interesting. Pleased that you've asked the question, Rosie, because I know lots of women writers who were asked about how many children they've got and how they managed to find time to write, almost regardless of what the book's about. Approval's about a man on a quest to try and have a baby, to adopt a child. And it should be about that. And that's the social issue, and that's the personal engine behind it. So the long-winded answer to your question is fiction, because, well, that's as close as I've got to saying, you know, this is real stuff that happens to me and people like me. Yeah.
And I think such an kind of leads on to my next question, which is that such an integral part of the way that is explored in a fictionalized way is through David, who is a flawed character. You sympathize with him, you don't always like him completely, but I think that's so important to the book's complexity and the way that you're invited into the judging process as a reader. And I wondered if it was always important for you to have a character who was like that, so you're not having readers who will really come down hard on one side, you're kind of left with questions.
Yeah, so it's been a critical part of the editing process, because if you have an individual short story in which a character, for example, is involved in a moment of violence, well, you can kind of let extreme things happen in that moment and leave lots of ambiguity and leave lots out about the character. In a novel, there's been a real balancing act, to sort of tightrope of I want people to sympathise with David, but I don't want him to be a sympathetic character. I want each reader to have a realistic chance of getting to the very end, having not formed a judgment. And quite a lot of the editing process has been about, yeah, well, if he ever said that, I don't really want to read on, I'm not going to like this guy. Or if this happened to him, oh, now I feel so sympathetic that I'm gunning for him all the time. That the process itself is completely cold and objective. And I want the reader to have the chance to say, well, yes, there's this aspect, and no, there's that side of things. But yes, coming back to the flawed character, you mentioned Jem before, her first novel, Kind of Intimacy, she has a character called Annie, who is more or less irredeemably awful character, and it's in her point of view, and she's, you know, listening to the neighbours and imagining relationships with people, and she's kind of terrifying character, and we kind of know that we're building up to find out the awful thing that she's done, and yet there's something utterly engaging about the humanity and reality of a person who's somehow been left on the outside of everything. And that's what you're always, I think, hoping to achieve, is that you write a character that is believable enough that there is some sympathy, and that if they're a bad person, they can still do good things, or if they're a good character, they can still do bad things. And that's been probably the main part of the last stage of the editing process, that you couldn't have too many stories or too many chapters in which David's a good guy. But at the same time, if you pointed out all of his flaws, you'd think, oh, well, I'd never allow this guy to be a parent. So it's been a real sort of balance on the edge where readers can get all the way through to the end and think, oh, well, here's how I'd read this guy. Even though, of course, you've only seen 13 or 14 episodes out of 50 years of the guy's life.
I'm sure you'll be interested to hear readers' kind of their judgments as they.
Yeah, I'm expecting extremes. I'm expecting in the current climate, they'll love or hate him.
Yeah. So would you be able to do as a reading from Approval now?
Sure, I'll do a little bit. I'll put the other glasses in. I'll read.
That's fine.
It'll be very short. So just to introduce, the shape of it has each story is prefaced with an imagined version of the page in the application process. Tell us about your childhood, tell us about your family, list all your previous relationships, let's go into your finances, and so on. So I'll read the first one just to sort of set a tone, and then I'll pick just a very short 2 pages, 2 minutes from the very first story that addresses it. So it's pairs, if you like, of question followed by story that become chapters. So part 1, motivation for adoption. Part 1 is all about exploring why you think you'll be a good parent. Are you a parent of older children already and want to extend your family, or will this be the first child in your household? Your social worker will be keen to understand your motivation to adopt, your pathway to the decision to apply, and your present circumstances, including whether you have or have had any children or stepchildren together or separately. Brackets if applying as a couple, close brackets. If you have attempted to have your own biological child, including IVF or any other fertility treatment, you must describe where you're up to in that process and your past experiences, e.g. any failed pregnancies. It is not allowed for an application for adoption to proceed concurrently with any fertility treatment, such as a private IVF program. If there is a risk of pregnancy during the approval process, you must discuss this with your social worker before you proceed, and you'll be expected to take precautions. So each story has one of these sort of scene setting things. And in the first story, which is called Motivation, we meet David and Cece, who are talking about how to decorate the nursery. And then David sits in the pub in exactly the sort of scene that I've just described. And they find the comedy in the man's role. I'm not going to read that bit because his pal Dougie is a Geordie, and if I do read it out with the accent, I might offend people from Newcastle or from the Northeast in general, and probably some Welsh people as well. So I'll read the part that really goes to the nub of the motivation of the couple, and it's not quite 2 pages. Cece is lying on her back with her legs in stirrups beneath a humming air conditioning unit. She's wearing only a loose blue hospital gown, no underwear. She's straining her head to see a monitor above her. At her side, a nurse is rolling a scanner over the flat stomach of her patient, asking her to confirm her name and date of birth the 3rd time, whilst giving gentle reassurance with her eyes. 2 doctors in white coats are whispering below the monitor. The male one has a strong Eastern European accent. In the corner of the room, perched on a flimsy plastic chair, sits David. He's bent forward, arms on legs, fingers intertwined. He looks up at the sound of Cece's name. A square hatch in the opposite wall opens. A face appears. A young woman with blue eyes, metal-framed glasses, white coat, mask. She asks the doctors whether they're ready. They speak softly and make small head movements that can only mean no. They return to their secret debate. The hatch clicks shut. David stares at Cece till she twists her head around. He sticks his tongue out. She tries to smile, fails. The brown eyes are glistening. He looks at 2 information sheets on the wall beside him. Photos of mothers holding babies next to men with good teeth in woolly jumpers. Statistics in cheerful yellow, a graph, 40% success rate. Images of splitting cells, 2, 4, 8. Perfect embryos, photogenic babies. The door swings open. A man with white tufty hair and a pink tie strides through, causing everyone except Cece in her stirrups to hold themselves more upright. He grins confidently at the patient, stands very close to the 2 doctors. His crisp, plummy voice is clearer than the others, but not loud enough that any words can be heard. He frowns at the monitor. The woman doctor lowers her head and points out a detail on the paper in her hand. Pink tie turns around with a professional smile. My colleagues are concerned at this quite large shadow near the ovary, fluid perhaps. He points his hand as if delivering a lecture. Given that we're so very pleased with the embryos, I think it's best to they'll be safe there for a few months. Better deal with the shadow first. Pink tie carries on speaking. He's explaining medical terms and telling them there's a choice of strategies. David and Cece don't say anything. He's bent over again. She's trying to avoid eye contact, but eventually she looks up. She's sobbing silently. His throat is blocked. He closes his eyes. Can't breathe, drowning, school swimming pool, chlorine in my eyes, boy drowned here, emergency, ambulance, can't look, CC hurting, no baby, hospital, waiting, injections, scars, no parking spaces, dead babies, CC bleeding, sperm in a plastic cup, shadow, lump, cancer, operation, change for the car park, perfect embryos, dead twins, blood on the bathroom floor, CC crying, last chance, boys don't cry, can't breathe. The nurse touches his shoulder. Are you all right? We'll be fine, I'll look after her. He takes a clean tissue from his jacket pocket and moves to Cece's side. The nurse heads for the door. I'll leave you alone while she gets dressed, and I'll take your invoice through to reception. You can stay here a few minutes if you want a bit of privacy. She smiles at Pink Tie. Professor Knight will write to your GP about the next steps. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for listening. So that's the first story, set you up now to go and find out the question to go on.
Thank you. And that was brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that'll have intrigued everyone, and we'll hear another small extract from approval at the end of the event. So I'll now move on to questions for Juliana. Juliana, you're at a very different stage of the process to John, I suppose, in that your book's been out for a few months now. I think it was published in February. How have you experienced being published as a direct result of winning the NorthBound Award? And do you think the experience has shaped how you work now?
It's a really interesting question. It's been a joy. So being published by Saraband has been great. I think being published by an independent press, by an independent publisher, you have the opportunity to get involved in a lot more if you want to. And I don't imagine that you get that if you're with one of the really big companies because they have other people to do everything. And I had all sorts of anxieties about the manuscript. As I say, it was something that I did, similar to Adam. I submitted it and I thought I may not look at it again for a year, for a while. I needed some time away from it, but I won. And then suddenly we were we're going to be editing it. And so it was still very close to me because I wasn't sure I was ready for it to go out into the world yet. And everybody at Sarah Brand was incredibly patient with me and let me take it back in and have my own kind of go at editing it before I had an editor come in and work with me. And at each stage, I had opinions and anxieties and things I wanted to share. And yeah, and kind of yourself, Aisling, Sarah, were always open to listen to my ideas and to allow them to feed into the process. So even at the point at which I think we were 2 months away from the publication date, and I found this image that I fell in love with, and we were all happy with the cover that we had. But I'd said, oh, this is really nice. Could we have this for the paperback? And then Sarah and Aisling kind of stopped the world and turned it around and actually said, we'll do that for the hardback. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. For myself, I've been full of anxiety and I've had lots of doubts about things and wanted to get it just right. But as John was saying about Jen Ashwood, that you see your book in a shop and you want to kind of take it off and change lots of things about it. At every single stage of the process, there were things that I wanted to change about what I had done. So there's something about learning to let it go, learning when enough is enough. And so that's definitely something that this process has taught me. But I think I had a very lovely guide in Sarah Brand as publishers. Whether it will change the way that I work, I think I need to understand that it's not always like this. And that it's, yeah, and I think at the point at which the final draft was sent in, Sarah was going to send it to get published, whether or not, even if I had other changes, that was it now. So I think there's something about letting it go and knowing that you're probably never going to write the thing that was in your head at the beginning, and being happy to deal with what it is that you've managed to achieve.
Yeah, and it is such a beautiful cover now. So I think a great choice all around. It was wonderful before as well, but this one is gorgeous. And so that idea of kind of letting it go now, that when you send the final draft in, I heard you say in your interview with Ella Wakatama that kind of every time you wrote a draft, it felt like a different book. I think you mentioned that earlier this evening as well. And now you have let it go in two senses, and it's kind of in the world and in the hands of readers, which is what John's just about to experience. Has the book changed for you again since you read how other people have responded to it? Has that changed the way that you feel about the book? Or
so it hasn't become a different book since being published. I think it became a different book every time I edited it or redrafted it, because whenever I came back to the redrafting process, there was always a new question. I remember at one stage getting to the end of a draft and realizing that quite an important character in the novel had kept a secret, not only from the protagonist, but from me as the writer. I didn't know why they kept that secret. And so the next time I was having to do the redraft, I had to understand why they hadn't shared that and write in and make more apparent, kind of plant the seeds for the reasons why they might have chosen not to share that. And so each time I wrote it, there was something that I was focusing on that made it feel as though it was something different. And also several of the times I wrote drafts, the form changed, or I was trying to play around with it. But now it's done and I've had to let it go, and it's out in the world. And it is what it is, I suppose. The thing that has surprised me is that all sorts of people have read it and responded to it that I may never have imagined. And I didn't think I had a particular reader in mind, but perhaps I did, because I'm always surprised at the diversity of people who have read it and who give responses to it. And also what people choose to focus on. Things that I may have written and thought about, but may not have been a really big thing for me. Somebody, And I would suggest, if you get the chance, John or Adam, to do a book club, it's the best thing, because it's a group of people who've read your book, who have opinions on it, and they talk about it with a lot of insight. And sometimes the insights that they had about particular moments really surprised me, because it may have been a detail that I wasn't necessarily focusing on in any deep way, because there were other things that I was obsessing about when I was writing that chapter, or exploring a particular theme. So it's been the biggest surprise has been the range of people that have engaged with the book, and also the different things that people pick up on. And actually, perhaps to give something specific, in an event that I did, there was a woman who now lives on the South Coast and who's originally from Northumberland. And there's a section of the book that mentions Grace Darling. And she said she was really, really moved when she read that, because that's a story that was with her as a young woman, and she's never heard it anywhere else outside of the Northeast. And actually, Grace Darling was this kind of huge, heroic feminine figure. And that led her into the book in a very specific way, and she found connections with the book because of that. And things like that I had never imagined.
Yeah, I think Northumberland is one of those places where if you go regularly, it's my favourite place in the country. And I think the Grace Darling story especially is just sort of ingrained into your mind, especially, and all those images like we were talking about before with Holy Island and Lindisfarne. But having mentioned those places in the book, there's also all the surroundings of Accra in Ghana, and there's sort of references to the nature and wildlife there. And I wondered what role that played in writing the book, given that Holy Island especially had such a kind of specific relationship to the characters.
I think nature was really important to me. I was born in the city. I was born in Cardiff in Wales, and I grew up in cities. I grew up in London before moving north. And so I'm used to urban landscapes, but as a young reader, I read lots of things that were set in rural landscapes. And so I always had this longing for the natural world. And it was only, I think, in my 20s that I first went camping, that I learned to swim, that I started to build a relationship with the natural world. And also living in the Northeast, where 20 minutes in either direction, you've got the coast or the countryside and the city. So you had kind of all of it in close proximity. And so I wanted to write about it. And there was something, I wanted the main character, Imani, to have a relationship with nature that feels elemental, as though she has all of these difficult relationships with various people in her life, but that within the environment she belonged.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that really comes across again when reading the book. And I wondered if you'd be able to do a reading for us now from Castles.
I'm just going to do a very short reading from very early on in the novel, and it kind of sets up. The novel begins with Imani returning to the island, and she encounters lots of past selves, but this sort of sets that up. It's called Arrival. Sparrows chirrup and settle on the cold slate shingles of the old shop roof. The shop used to be called Edie's Saintly Sherbets. It had a wooden sign hand-carved by Edward Grimald, with a little symbol that looked a little bit like a soldier's helmet, but was meant to be the rice paper fizzy sweets that gave the shop its name. Mr. Grimald's sign has been replaced by a white plaque with EP written in large blue font, and Edward's Place scrawled beneath it like an absent-minded doodle. I stand in front of it, examining the shop's transformation. A layer of snow powders the shop roof and lightly covers every surface, from the trees to parked cars to the cobbled stone paths. No one is around and the frosting is unblemished, but the sun has started to break through the clouds and the suggestion of warmth has begun to melt the sprinkle. I'm back. It's winter again, and time has folded in on itself to confuse me. It offers reflections as keepsakes, then snatches them away before I can catch them. I see ghosts everywhere, in the gloom of the trees, the nooks and crannies of the lanes, in shop windows, and out in the waves. A shadow crosses my path. My 19-year-old self steps out of the shop with a paper bag in her hand and a rucksack on her back. Her focus is on the contents of the paper bag. Peering inside, she inspects the sweets. She bundles the bag into the side of her pocket and looks up, straight at me. Squinting, she shields the glare of the sun with her hand, as though trying to see me more clearly. She pauses for a moment, then turns and walks away. My 12-year-old self nudges past me and drops a book in the brief collision. I bend to look at the fallen thing, but she snatched it up before I can read the title. I find myself running along to keep up with her and realize too late where she's heading. The large iron gates are confrontational, and the redwood trees beyond it cast huge shadows. 12 walks into the grounds and strides along the path to the main building. Cradling her books in one arm, she searches inside her satchel and retrieves a key, unlocks the door, pushes it open, and is gone. I'm left alone, outside. The old building looks frail and infirm in the winter sun. Light is so unforgiving. I've always preferred the warmth of darkness, where you can hide until you're ready to be seen. I open the gate tentatively and walk towards the first redwood tree that lines the path. I hesitate, then touch it, press my cheek against its spongy bark, and wrap my arms as far around its trunk as they will go. Voices from the distance pull me out of the embrace. A group of tourists has stopped, and they peer through the gate. I let go of the tree and walk towards the building, escaping their gaze. In front of the convent, I wait before knocking. I pick up the brass knocker and bang on the door as a guest might. The sound is deep and full. After a few moments, the oak door creaks and staggers open. Sister Alma smiles up at me. We stare at each other from opposite sides of the threshold. Me, the gangly dark Amazon. Her, the squat, yellowing cherub. Her skin almost transparent now. We've missed you. Her words are whispered. Her eyes are wet. I've missed you too, I say. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Hearing all these being read is making me want to go back to the start and read these books again. That was wonderful. I'll move on now to questions for Adam, our most recent winner of the NorthBound Book Award. So Cold Fish Soup. The first thing I wanted to kind of ask about this and the experience of writing it, it's certainly not a book about lockdown or COVID-19, but I think that the themes there are certainly ones that will really resonate with people, even more so after the last kind of 18 months, especially with mental illness and grief as well. And they're obviously issues we find very difficult to speak about, but that you write about with such warmth, and treat them as they are, which is part of a full kind of human experience. So I wondered if writing about these themes in the context of a pandemic affected how you approached them. Or did you write it in, or were some of them written beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, most of it was written in the middle of the pandemic. It didn't really change the way I technically wrote about those kind of topics, but it had an effect on it. It was weirdly sort of a positive effect, and it's a strange creative response to have to a global pandemic, but there was a positive to be pulled from it, because there are times when you're writing a memoir and you're aware that you're not famous, and that seems quite an indulgent thing to be doing, and then that you're telling stories about isolation and death and grief and mental health issues on a coastline that no one cares about, and you start to wonder why you're doing it, and is this just for me, and is anyone ever going to be sort of interested? Who is my audience? And then when the pandemic kicked in, and I was reading the news and reading social media and seeing what people were going through, they were going through isolation and dealing with death and grief and strain on their mental health and longing and all the issues that I was writing about. So it made me feel like I was writing to a national mood or global mood, and I wasn't in a bubble anymore. So I really found that, it gave me some creative juice, which was a strange thing to feel. It felt bad to have got some energy for something bad happening, but it worked. Yeah. And I also had time as well. I had more writing time than ever. because my commute disappeared. So I have extra hours in the morning to just dedicate to this book.
Yeah, of course. And you were saying about it being a memoir, but I think it's also kind of like a memoir of a place as well. And I wondered if you were in Withensea when you wrote the book, and if you were or weren't, and if you were kind of trapped away from it or trapped in it, if that affected how you wrote about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a book that where home and place is absolutely everything, and it was really important to me to write authentically about that region and the environment and the people that were there. So I started writing it in earnest, I guess, in the summer of 2019, and I went on a research trip and interviewed a few people and made loads of notes and took photos, and then just went back to Manchester and started writing in earnest, fully thinking like if I needed to speak to anyone or needed to fill in some details, I could just jump in the car and 2 hours later I'd be there. And then suddenly that was illegal. And I had to just try and conjure up the very specific environment of the northeast coast in a kitchen in Manchester, where I wrote most of the book. And it was a challenge being away for it for a number of reasons, because it's although I wasn't born there, I moved to the East Yorkshire coast and to Withensea at a very crucial point in my life. So it's very much in my blood, and it's the place I think of as home. So I found when I was going on social media, looking at people tweeting about the beach, I'd feel really territorial, like that's my space. And I was sort of desperate to get back there. But I was also aware that I needed, from a practical standpoint, to get back there and really write and do some more research. So as soon as that first lockdown was lifted, the first thing I did was go over to see my family and just do some really intense research. And just filmed things and took photos and wrote, about everything I smelt and tasted and saw, and got in the sea and just did all this stuff to really absorb all of that sensory information. So when we went back to Manchester and another lockdown could have happened, I could squeeze on that sponge for my sensory information and keep myself going. And that was vital. But when I actually finished the book, so my sort of final draft, I took myself on a final week-long retreat to Filey, just past Holderness, where most of the book is set. And I left my incredibly elderly dog with my girlfriend, drove over, spent the night writing, went to sleep, ready to get up and walk around on the beach and then start writing. And I had all these messages from her to say that the dog was incredibly ill and she'd catastrophically pooed the sofa and was probably going to die. So I had to jump in the car and drive back to Manchester to find that the dog was absolutely fine. There was nothing wrong with her. And then when I got back, it was just before the October lockdown. There was another lockdown. So I meant that I'd come back for this dog that was very happy to see me. And I was, unable to get to that coast again. So I spent that week in my bedroom listening to sea sounds on Spotify and glaring at the dog. But it was a challenge. It was a real challenge.
Yeah. And did you find that you had misremembered things when you went back and immersed yourself in?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's some things like when you go into cold sea, the idea of when you think of cold water, you would think it would turn you blue, and you would feel like it would do certain things to your skin. But when I got back in the water and felt that sort of biting North Sea cold, it's like, oh no, I'm bright red. I look like I'm boiling, and these are things that I had to fill in. So it was absolutely vital to get out there and, like I say, write authentically about it. Yeah.
Before I ask you to do a reading, I also wondered if, I've asked you quite serious questions so far, but Cold Fish Soup is also very funny. There are some really funny moments in it. And I wondered if there were any parts that were particularly fun to write, or if you have any kind of bonus stories about about Withensea or about anything, or about your mum?
Yeah, it's
Didn't make it.
I found it almost all of it was fun to write. I know lots of writers who kind of detest writing, but like the actual practice of it, they like the end result, but that sort of getting stuck into it thing is actually quite uncomfortable for them. But I found it was, I think, partly because it was always my goal to write an entertaining book, and ideally a funny book. And that was a challenge when you're writing about, there's themes, there's suicide and there's grief and mental illness, and there's a town that's dying and no one cares. And there's all these serious subjects that deserve to be treated with sensitivity and tenderness and humanity, and not sort of avoid the pain of them by making jokes. So I had to find a balance, and I think the sweet spot there, and the way I was able to write about this stuff, was the humanity of it, because I've written a lot about my family in this book, and I come from a family that communicates through stories and humor, and it's how we navigate challenging times, how we get through difficult things. We joke and we do ridiculous things to push through it. So I focused on those sorts of things, and they were a joy to write about. Talk about my mum. There's an essay that particularly focuses on her, and also my sister, because they're both part of a mature burlesque troupe called the Ruby Red Performers, and they started doing these shows up and down the Yorkshire coast, and they ended up getting on Britain's Got Talent and making it through to the live semi-final. And they had this ridiculous routine where my mum was scooting backwards and forwards across the stage on this gold scooter, and they had all these mad outfits and dancers with them. And the finale of their performance, my mum and my sister's bras just exploded in these 6-foot jets of flame, and that's how they dealt with their grief and their sort of challenges in life. And they ended up going on, like, performing on a cruise ship and at Pride, and they were in a Sainsbury's advert, and they just did all this mad, interesting stuff. And I think, if you can't enjoy yourself when your mum's boobs explode on TV, then when can you really? So there were all of these wonderful things to write about, and I think it's one of the joys of nonfiction, or like life writing or memoir writing, is that as long as you're paying attention, there are stories everywhere, and if you know how to pick up on the important bits and put them together, you're never going to run out of material. And my mum, who was pledged to live to 107, is always there to provide me with stories. She has learned to breathe fire. So, like, I call up my mum, she'll tell me something like that, and I've got the kernel of 2 or 3 essays. So I'm never going to run out of material. And in terms of additional stories, that there'll be a book 2. They'll just be full of more mum stories. Got to keep some stuff back.
Great. Would you be able to do a reading now?
Yeah. I'm going to read a piece of an essay called "God Hates Withensea," which is focuses on the catastrophic erosion problem on that part of the coastline. And I'm jumping in at a point where I'm discussing the Holderness coast, which is a stretch of the East Yorkshire coast. It stretches for 61 kilometres, from the storybook chalk cliffs of Flamborough Head down to the Spurn Point Nature Reserve, where you can sometimes find an abundance of brown-tail moth caterpillars, and often a bloated dolphin corpse. Spurn Point is a 3-mile-long arc of land reaching out into the mouth of the Humber estuary, partially built from the eroded cliffs that have washed down from the rest of the coastline. Walk along its beaches and you're more than likely treading on the ground down and transported remains of a once happy and laughter-filled family home that succumbed to the sea generations earlier. The composer, Vaughan Williams, wrote Andante Sostenuto in E-flat after visiting there, a swooning and pastoral piece It suggested he did not encounter a dead dolphin or stand contemplating the bleak provenance of the sands while a determined storm attempted to blow his head from his shoulders. But for me, admiring the beauty of Sperm Point while knowing how it came to be began to seem perverse, like severing your carotid artery and then using your final minutes of life to applaud the elegant way that your blood pools around your body. Don't be weird, my mother would say when I voiced my concerns in this way. It's fine, someone will do something. But it is like that, I tell her. It's like that woman with the steamroller. My mother claims to have known a woman who was run over and killed by a steamroller while riding her moped. She'd been travelling through temporary traffic lights just ahead of it when the sequence malfunctioned and shone green in both directions. She was forced to brake by another vehicle heading towards her, and while she panicked and contemplated her next move, the steamroller gradually caught up with her. There she was, my mother would say, flat as a pancake, squashed into the tarmac with her bike. The improbability of this story is great, and I dare say it was told to me as a moral lesson. My mother has lots of stories like this. The boy whose eyes fell out while headbanging to heavy metal music, the musician who was impaled on his drum stool in a prank gone wrong. Whatever point the steamroller story was intended to make, it was lost on me when I chose to take it literally. And it's the visual that most often comes to me when I consider the predicament facing the people of Withensea. The threat of erosion is devastating, but there's time to avoid it. It's not so fast that nothing can be done about it, but instead, people have just decided to wait and hope that it does not kill them.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant and very funny. So before I go to audience questions, because we've had a few coming in, I'm just going to say a tiny bit about the kind of practical logistical stuff about the NorthBound Book Award for anyone who's interested in submitting or just interested generally. So as I mentioned earlier, it's an award that is offered in partnership by New Writing North, Saraband and the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. It's open to writers based in the north of England with a complete, unpublished, full-length manuscript for a fiction or narrative non-fiction book written for adult readers. And submissions are actively welcomed from emerging as well as established authors and from people of all backgrounds, so long as you fulfil the residence requirements. So it can be your first book that you've submitted, or you can have been previously published before. The winning writer receives £5,000 provided by the University of York and an invitation to present their work as part of the university's Writers at York series, and the winner also receives a publication contract with Saraband. And then you can go on the website and you'll find full dates and eligibility criteria and everything there. Great, so I will now do some audience questions. We've had some really good ones come in. There's a couple of kind of quick fire ones, not to put you on the spot, but first one, do you have a favourite Northern book or favourite author, classical, recent, fiction or non-fiction, or even a children's book? Tricky question, but...
I have a couple of people that come to mind just because I've read things recently.
Yeah.
Written. Sarah Hall. I really like. I want to say Jackie Kay as well. I think she's based in Manchester, but she's Scottish as well. But yeah, so they both came to mind, that question with me.
Yeah, wonderful choices. Anyone else bold enough to?
Al Baghdadi, Jen Ashworth.
I was just not to there.
I'm impressed, and I get the Baghdadi on Jen. And also, if I think about it, no, I'm going to have to think for a minute. Adam, you chip in.
Notes Made While Falling by Jen Ashworth.
Yeah,
is a very good memoir and essays. So that was the first book to pop into my head. I'm sure there are a lot. I've just picked up this book by Richard Smith or Smythe, and just started it, and it's wonderful. The Woodcock, and it's set in the 1920s on the North Sea coast. That's a beautiful book, and I think that's only come out in the last few weeks, but I'd recommend that as well.
Great.
The other one that I'd have to say always Alan Bennett. everything he's ever written, but particularly his monologues, Talking Heads.
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
read
To me of
5 times and watched 6.
Yes. Yeah.
I like a monologue,
So they're new versions as well, which are great. Yeah, if you think of any more, you can kind of frantically comment on the YouTube video. And
we should have known the answer to that.
Julia Darling actually is one that's just come to mind. Please, darling.
Yeah. And another one that might be possibly harder to answer, but if you had to set all your future writing in one location, where would you choose?
Mine would be where I've set this book.
Yeah.
It's so rich and it's disappearing. So if I'll have to keep writing about it because it won't be there forever.
Write it back in distance. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I was inspired by the other two tonight, I think I'd set mine somewhere on the coast because it works so well in your novels, but maybe a post-apocalyptic Morecambe.
Interesting.
I'll pull a few things from there.
I don't know if this is allowed because it's quite big, but the Northeast.
That's fine.
It's a place.
And also there's quite a lot. There's city, there's coast, countryside.
Very.
If that's cheating.
No,
Cheating a bit, I think.
That's a loophole, that's fine. Okay, so slightly more kind of open-ended question. Sounds like you've all had wonderful advice along the way that's really helped to shape your writing. And what advice would you give to a writer starting out and trying to find their voice?
The first thing that comes to my mind is carry on writing, because it's dead easy now. Oh, we've won an award, published the book. Now I'll write the second book and carry on. At every stage, there's always that voice in the back of your head that's saying, no one's going to ever read this rubbish, you idiot. What are you writing this for? But if you continue to write, just by the law of attrition, just with the theory of enough monkeys and typewriters, eventually I think you do manage to write something. So the thing that I always insist on when I'm teaching creative writing is during each lesson we're going to write something, and after each lesson you're going to write something and keep on writing. And it sounds incredibly obtuse and simple, but rather than concentrating on any particular technical aspect, if you carry on writing and make it part of your routine and don't give up. And I've frequently thought, do you know what, easy, I'll just get a job. And I've even made myself busy enough teaching other subjects, so I've had to avoid the fact that I've got to carry on writing. But yeah, you will eventually get there if you carry on. I don't know if you two would agree with this philosophy.
Yeah, I think that idea that not stopping and just, even if it's like if you go and see a stand-up at the start of their career and then you see them 10 years later, and that repeated, like not giving up will just sort of toughen them and mold them into something that's a much better version than they were at the start. And sort of on that theme, I think spoken word is a really great place to start. Like you can get into a room, you can read excerpts of a novel you're working on, or a short story or a poem or whatever, and you're doing that in front of most often very supportive audiences of other writers who will then be supportive and tell you about opportunities. I mean, that's how I got started. Like I nervously turned up at a spoken word night and was able to then build up my confidence and think I can start submitting stuff. And when the world returns to normal, the first spoken word night you can get to would be a really great place to find your feet.
Round of applause really counts for something, even if there are 11 people in the back room of the pub.
Yeah, even a polite round of applause that's just tolerating you, it's got something.
I've never differentiated. I'm not tuned into that.
I think I would echo what you've both said. There's something about just writing and trying as much as you can to develop a routine around it. So not waiting for inspiration or that spark or the thing that will push you across, because even when that comes, it never lasts that long. And there's something that you just need to kind of keep the stamina with it and just keep going.
Can I say something slightly controversial? I don't believe there's any such thing as writer's block. I think it's a get out clause that we allow ourselves. If you can't, if the finance director turns up to the board meeting and, oh, so can you show us this month's cash flow forecast? No, I had finance director's block. We've invented this phrase that somehow it's not a profession like any other. No, I just didn't. I just decided not to do it today. That's what writer's block is, because everybody else has kids or a dog ruining the sofa, or somebody got run over by a steamroller. There are 11 reasons every day to not do it, and I don't know why there's a special privilege. That, oh no, I didn't feel the muse. Let's sit down and write just any old shit, because that's what most of us do most of the time.
Yeah, well, calling out all your colleagues there, fellow writers.
I'll be angry at YouTube comments now.
Yeah, that's it. I'll be totaled now. I'll be cancelled tomorrow.
Yeah, that's it. It's the end of you.
Cancelled. Writer's block. Although,
sorry about your book, John.
Although if they've managed to write something perhaps that inspired them and broken that. Wrote this.
Yeah. Well, what if? Yeah, maybe that'll be ammunition used against you by other people.
I'm sure I'll get killed tomorrow. I'll be looking out for
that. when you get writer's block or not. More questions. We have one about, so this is for everyone, but might be more relevant to John and Adam's work and experiences. Do you think male mental health is more of an issue in the North, or is it an equally problematic discussion topic around the UK?
I think it's a problem everywhere, really. I know there are funding issues for mental health support in more down at heel places, but yeah, it's everyone's problem, really. And I think the more we engage with it and write about it and discuss it, and if I think like my book, one of the themes that runs through it is the suicide of my brother, and I know that we never spoke about how he felt. We never got into these really important discussions that we should have had. So yeah, I think if you write about that kind of stuff, and if that gives anyone the nudge that maybe I should check in with that person, I think that's a really important step forward.
I agree. I don't think it's something peculiar to a certain location. I've no evidence on that. But I agree with Adam. It's our responsibility to say, yeah, I also had these feelings, and it's a big step to go to the pub with your old mate and say, this week I had some really dark thoughts on Tuesday. But then if you do, you might get the surprising answer, yeah, me too. It's tricky, isn't it? And I think we have a responsibility to write about that and to be honest and start to admit that male mental health is something that shouldn't be a secret.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because it turns out when, for example, Adam, you write about it, and I'm sort of nodding my head, and it's it's not just you. That's kind of what a lot of people are thinking.
Yeah.
And it's lovely to read about it in such an honest way, but it encourages them to say, "Hey, did you read this? Adam's written this book. That's a story about these sorts of issues." And I think there's real value in using your own experience in the honest way that you have done, and I think we should all try and do that.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pushed to find someone that hasn't had some sort of brush with it, or knows someone who's been deeply affected by a mental health issue. So yeah, it's everyone's problem.
Yeah, and I do think that both of your books really will go a long way in starting those conversations and opening them up in different ways. So yeah, thank you for writing about those things with in the way that you do. So final question from the audience before we get one more reading from approval, which is, what are you all writing next? If you want to say, yeah, I don't know who wants to jump in on that, but
I can start briefly as we're all sitting in silence.
Well, you're the first anyway, Juliana.
Yeah.
You're the
I'm working on another novel. It's very different to Castles. What to say about it? I suppose one of the focal relationship is between a husband and a wife, and it's exploring, I suppose, health and our understandings of well-being. This isn't describing it well at all, but I am working on something else that I haven't yet worked out how to talk about, that feels very different to the first book.
Oh, well, I'm very excited to read that when it's finished. John, is your next in the process?
Okay, so, well, we did, Adam, I think you've threatened there might be a book 2, and we talked earlier about form and structure and novel versus short story, and there have been a number of conversations about the relationship between how different would approval be if it was a collection of short stories, and what would you do with those versions of the stories that you've amended, or the parts that didn't fit, or the new stories you've written since. So there's a very interesting conversation that might become more than a conversation about a different version of approval as short stories. And while we're thinking about that, I do have a collection of short stories with a working title of Et in Arcadia Ego, because I looked through all the titles and thought, I wonder what the unifying theme of this is. Well, the old people die in that, the mother dies in that, or the murder in that one. There's a story of The Last of the Mohicans, which ends really badly for lots of Mohicans. And so it's about death. So there are a couple of bits of comedy in it. So short stories all the way for the next, probably till at least the end of next year, short stories. There is a memoir biography thing, but that's for later. Short stories all the time.
Brilliant.
Well, get me back into short stories.
I'm sure. I'm very excited to read that as well. Adam, what about you?
Well, I've just got a commission. I was approached by the Portico Prize team because they're putting together a series of podcasts about different underexplored areas in the north, and they heard about that I was writing about a very underexplored area, and said, "Do you want to produce this podcast and write an essay?" So that I've got to head over there sometime in November and do some on-location readings of a new piece that I'm working on right now about on Christmas Eve last year. I could 10 sperm whales washed up on the beach at Withensea. It was all about the environmental aspects of why that happened and how people dealt with that. And I'm sort of drilling down into this strange set of circumstances, this sort of desperately sad thing that happened at Christmas, with an eye to making it hopeful. So I've got to try and make it sort of an appealing story to listen to while being very dark. So that's my challenge. But that's going to be going out as part of the Portico Prizes events series towards the end of November.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I'll definitely keep an eye out for that. That sounds fascinating. Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for answering all those questions. I think we're just going to finish with one more reading from John of approval, if that's all right.
Thank you, Rosie. I'll do the same as before. I'll try and keep it very short. I'll just read. So we've done, school and religion and list all your previous relationships. In section 8 of the slightly fabricated version of the application process, the heading is Understanding of Addiction, Violence and Abuse. So I'll read you that introduction and just the first page or so of the story that responds to this. As you will have learned from your 3-day fostering and adoption training and development program, many potential adopted children will have had some experience of neglect or deliberate abuse, often as a consequence of alcohol misuse or drug addiction. What have you learnt about these issues and what coping strategies do you have? How do you plan to effectively manage the development of a child who may have birth issues such as fetal alcohol syndrome or developmental issues such as a result of maternal drug addiction, for example? If you've experienced any difficulties yourself in the past with addiction, please describe your history. Honesty is always best. This will not necessarily prohibit your application, but may lead to further investigation. If there's been any situation in which there was a child in the household where there may have been alcohol misuse or drug misuse, you must explain the circumstances fully, including the steps you took to ensure the safeguarding of the child. Children. We'll also need to speak to the other parent of any child affected to ensure that you took every possible step to protect the child/children. So the story that responds to this is another episode from David's past. There are funny bits in this, just this isn't one of them. Her shoes. That's it. Right, there's a lock the door. Finally ending that whole sorry chapter. We couldn't have carried on like that. I just wish they'd let me put her shoes on when they took her away. By the time they got here, Alice had calmed down. She was sitting quietly in her favourite chair in the conservatory drinking coffee, with nothing in it, I checked. And she might have been all right, but the blood on the kitchen roll wrapped round my hand caught their eye. When they arrived, I was wearing my old glasses held together with sellotape. The new ones are lying next to the kettle, all twisted with no lenses in them. Glasses all in the bin, apart from the bit that got in my hand. That's what gave it away, the blood. The woman officer worked it out. I couldn't lie, could I? It doesn't get you anywhere, that, lying. You have to face things. Yes, she did hit me, I told him, but only the once, and the glasses just sort of fell off. The other one, the man, kept asking me things over and over like he was Paxman or something. You haven't answered my question. He asked why my hands were swollen. I've got a rash from the Christmas tree, an allergic reaction to the glue Danny calls them my incredible Hulk hands. Where did the blood come from, the man asked. Then it was, why did she stand on them? And I don't see how that could have been an accident. He was so damn persistent. He seemed determined to have someone to blame. Blame doesn't solve anything. And then he realised they'd been here twice before. At one point, they seemed to think I might have hit her. What kind of man must they think I am? I have to admit it was scary when the glasses came off. I couldn't see properly and I was scrambling around on the floor and she was screaming accusations at me. It's my own fault, really. I shouldn't have put my hand there and stopped bleeding for ages. But it didn't hurt in that way. It was a sort of relief. It's the first time in days I haven't noticed the itching. Glasses made a really loud crunching noise when she stamped on them. She deliberately picks things that make dramatic sounds. The chime of a metronome echo around in the body of the piano, a dinner plate smashed against the marble fireplace, much more satisfying than the tinkle of the wine glass. Not that we've got any wine glasses left. She drinks out of a mug these days, thinks I won't be able to tell how much she's had. But I keep a close eye on her. I know most of her hiding places. Those half bottles of vodka are only small, but with practice you can spot the red tops. Found 4 last week, one in the toilet system in the ensuite. I have a little circuit that I do every night. It takes about 10 minutes if I've had a quick search during the day. My personal best is 3 in one night. Inside a box of sugar puffs, gardening coat sleeve and top shelf of Danny's toy cupboard. Anyway, that's when I called the police, when my glasses got broken. I just panicked. You can't leave things like that. Someone might get hurt. But I wish they'd been a bit more patient and let me put her shoes on. She took them off when she went in the conservatory because the glass stuck to the soles. She'd have gone to bed quietly if they'd given her a bit more time. It was nearly midnight and she must have been tired. And she wouldn't need to get up tomorrow. I could look after Danny. And so it goes on. Another cheerful episode in the life of David as we delve into his past.
Thank you so much for that second reading. Yeah, that was brilliant. And thank you to everyone for reading tonight and for answering those questions. This has been so interesting and so enjoyable, and I've learned so much about all 3 books and I want to go and read them all again with that new knowledge. And yeah, I hope all of you and everyone watching has also enjoyed it as much as I have. I'll also say that signed copies of Approval and also of Castles from Cobwebs are available to buy from Fox Lane Books. And there will be links for that in the YouTube chat as well. And this will also be available to watch on YouTube later if you missed the start or if you know someone else who will want to watch it. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to all three of you for speaking so wonderfully on your books.
Can I just end giving a thanks to you, Rosie, and all of the team at Saraband for organising this and for asking such interesting questions and prompting us. And
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. It was brilliant. Thank you so much. And congratulations again. And yeah, I hope you enjoy Approval being out in the world.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye.
Hopefully next time it'll be face to face.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. Yeah.